Okay, the second book of the Torah is in Hebrew. The name of the book is Shemot, which means names. Why do you call the book names? Because the opening statement of the book, if you have the art scrolls on page 293, otherwise we'll share the screen. But in any case, these are the names of the children of Israel who were coming to Egypt with Jacob. Each man and his household came, and the Torah lists the name of the people who came. The sons of Israel: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Yisachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the persons who emerged from Jacob's loins were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt. Okay, so that's why the beginning of the book reiterates where we need to know, where we need to be in the story. And that is, these are the people who came to Egypt. It actually doesn't say came, it says coming, which is another question, another story. But it's talking about the names, and therefore the name of the book is names, which is the second word of the book. Okay. But if you think about it, the name names is actually a boring book, because if you go to the library or to the bookstore and you pick up a book called Names, you have no idea what genre it is. You don't know what the book is going to be talking about. It could be anything. What does names mean? It's not descriptive. When you talk about the English name for the second book of the Torah, Exodus, now I already know. That's already an exciting name. Can sell some books, because there's drama. There's an Exodus, means we were stuck somewhere, then we have to go out of somewhere. It seems to be much more in line with the theme of the book, which is the theme of the second book, which is the Exodus from Egypt, receiving of the Torah. But the big theme, one of the big themes of the second book is, of course, the Exodus. So, but we don't name it Exodus. It's not one of the beginning of the words. We name it with a name that seemingly does not convey much. It sounds like a technical name. It doesn't sound like a meaningful name to capture the meaning of the book. That's what it seems. But there's always a lesson even from the name. And one interesting interpretation is as follows. The problem with there's a major transition when you get from book one to book two. Book one of the Torah, Genesis, is a book that discusses individuals, because it's a family, right? You have Adam and Eve, you have Noah, you had Abraham and Sarah, their children, Isaac and Rebekah. It's always individual. It's a very small family, and they are the characters of the book. So it's about individual people. When you come to the second book of the Torah, all of a sudden we move from family and we start talking about people. In other words, a nation. And very soon after the second book starts, verse number 9, the Egyptians Pharaoh was already referring to the Jewish people as Am B'nai Yisrael, the nation of the children of Israel, right? When Pharaoh is threatened by the Jewish people, he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel. People, Am is a nation. Am Yisrael, the nation Israel. Here they translate people, but it's the people of the children of Israel. So children of Israel means family. It's a few people. It's just a family, children of Israel. We talk about the nation of the children of Israel. Here we're a big nation. And a nation is a beautiful thing, because we grow and we become a nation. It's a wonderful thing. But there's also a danger with becoming a nation. What's the danger of a nation? The danger is that every individual thinks or may think that they are less important, because I'm part of the nation. The nation will work its stuff out. I don't have to be there, right? In other words, you can always say, okay, I understand the Jewish people have to do something. The Jewish people have to eat matzah on Passover. But do I? I'm just one in a very large nation. I am less significant. In Genesis, you can't think you're not significant, because imagine if Isaac would decide not to continue his father's legacy, there would be no Judaism, right? So in the first book, we understand that the legacy of monotheism, the legacy of Abraham, is dependent on individuals. But when you come to this book, you could say, hey, listen, you come to this book and you could say, we're a nation, individuals don't matter. And that's why the Torah that's perhaps why the name of the book is so important, because the name of the book is names, and we list the names of individual people. And that whole idea of a name is giving importance to every single individual. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's a name and a number. A number highlights the common denominator. You can say there's 70 people, or you're going to say however number the census represents. So there's a certain significance in a census, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the census highlights what we have in common. right? You say there's 320 million people in America, let's say, United States. So you're highlighting, what are you highlighting? You're highlighting not the individuality of each person, you're highlighting what they have in common. We're all citizens of this great country. But if you talk about names, a name represents the power of the individual. And that's why when we're shifting from the book of individuals to the book of nations, we highlight the importance of individual. And if you look through the stories of the Torah, even in this book, you could see that even when we're talking about events that are relevant to many people, the Torah goes out of its way to highlight the individual's importance. Just one example would be, I could bring multiple examples, but one example would be the giving of a Torah at Sinai. So there's 600,000 people at the foot of Mount Sinai. And yet when God speaks the 10 Commandments, commentaries point out, he speaks in the singular. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. So in English, your could be singular or plural. But in Hebrew, it's a different word. There's Elohecha, I'm your God in the singular. And then there's where we say in the Shema, the end of the third paragraph, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm your God in the plural, right? So here, God is speaking, even though there's 600,000 people there, God is speaking to every individual. And Medrash says every Jew feels that God is speaking to him as an individual. It's not like I'm just part of the big crowd. No, the crowd means a bunch of individuals. But really the importance and the relationship between every individual and God is critical. And that's important to highlight when we turn specifically to the second book, because the second book seems that we're moving to a nation, and a nation will detract of the importance of the individual. So we reiterate Shmot, names, and names means individuals. So I thought that's a beautiful introduction to the second book. And you could talk about it in other places in the book as well. But in all the big scenes of the book, there's an emphasis on the individual. So that is an introduction. Yeah, you agree?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So I already alluded to it, but in this counting of these are the names, Eilish Shmot Bnei Israel. I'll open the screen. So here in the beginning of the book, of the third book, we have two things. We have the names of some individuals. We don't count all 70. We just count the tribes, the tribes of the sons of Jacob. But we also have the number 70. So we talk about the numbers. We talk about numbers versus names. We'll talk about that in a second. And we'll read the Rashi. There's a lot of good stuff to talk about here. In just a moment, make sure this thing is cooperating. Okay, so I opened up the first verse and the Rashi. The Eilish Shmot Bnei Israel. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. Oh my God, what a terrible translation. Oh my God. Okay. With Jacob, each man and his household came, and then in verse 2, 3, 4, and 5, it lists the children of Israel. I just want to say that in this case, the art scroll is more accurate. These are the names of the children of Israel who were coming. Habaim is coming in the present tense. Okay. The problem with Habaim, the problem with who are coming, the problem is that they were not coming. They came in the past, right? Remember, they came 2 portions ago. They were in last parsha covered 17 years. They were in Egypt for at least 17 years by the time the second book opens. So why does the Torah say it in the present tense? So the Metsuda translation that I have on the screen from Chabad.org has no problem. It just changes the word. Instead of saying coming, it says who came. But that's not a great solution. So we'll get to that later. But I do want to say that we already know who came.
They're in Israel.
They're in Egypt. They're coming to Egypt, but they're not coming. They came because they came when 17 years earlier, when Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers. Joseph says, bring your family, bring my father, bring your family. And they've been living in Egypt for 17 years. And then and more than 17. Then Jacob dies 17 years later, and Joseph dies after that, a few decades after that. So it's more than 17. They've been in Egypt for a few decades. Then the second book opens up. How does the second book open up? These are the children of Israel who are coming to Egypt. Coming to Egypt, came to Egypt. So that's a problem. Put that on hold. I'll put that problem on hold. The other problem is, the more immediate problem is, we already know the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. How do I know? Because I just have to turn the page back a little bit. And when they actually came to Egypt, we actually have a list, and not just a list of the 12 sons of Israel, but we actually have a list of all 70. If you turn back to page 258, you'll see, or 259, and now these are the names of the children of Israel who were coming to Egypt. That was nice because then it was present tense. Yaakov, Ubanav, Yaakov and his sons, Jacob and his Jacob's firstborn Reuven, and then it lists all Reuven's sons. Then verse 10 goes Simon's sons. We already know this. We already know these names of these 12 children, the 12 sons of Israel. We already know the names of the 12 sons. We know that they already came to Egypt. This whole thing is redundant. So I'm not sure it's the biggest question, because maybe the literary people will tell you that's the way you do it. You're starting a new chapter. You want to give some new information. But Rashi addresses this question. And Rashi addresses this question here, but he also addresses the question, this concept in the book of Numbers. And the problem with the book of Numbers is that it's full of numbers. And the Torah seems to have a certain obsession with a census, counting again and again, counting. We already counted them in Vayigash 2 portions ago. We're counting them now again. So there's something about numbers. And what Rashi is going to say is that counting, he's, like I said, he says it here and elsewhere in the Torah as well, counting is an expression of love. If you love something, you count it, even if you know how many you have. So people have hobbies, they collect things. People collect, I don't know, baseball cards, jewelry, art. What else? What is stamps? Steve Strick has stamps, coins. But I know how many I have. But if I love it, I'm going to still pull it out. I'm going to set it on the table. I'm going to count it. That's an expression of love. So it's not that I don't know how many I have, but counting and reiterating represents the great love I have for it. So that's what Rashi says. Says Rashi.
Isn't it also responsibility? Like if you read the prayers, they're all instructional, really. And
Right.
isn't it everybody's, they mean it's everybody's responsibility to keep it, to get Israel to.
Yeah, so you're saying that's what I alluded to earlier, that when you say names and you say numbers, you say you matter. You're not just a number. A number means that you're part of a larger group. And we'll talk about in a minute, you're highlighting what we have in common with the group. That's what a number is. A name represents that you're an individual and nobody else can do what you could do. So that represents that individuality is alluded to in the name, but what we're highlighting is it's God's love towards you, and there's two aspects of that love. And one aspect is the individuality, and one aspect is what you have in common with everybody else. And both are important. But before we have to say, why does God keep counting? Doesn't he know? Doesn't he know how many people we are? So why is the Torah obsessed with the counting? Okay, we already remember, we said all this information. There's zero new information in verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Zero new information, just counting again and naming again. We know this already. It was already stated. So Rashi has, so the premise when you study Torah, the premise is that things are not written, there's nothing redundant. And if it's written again, it's for a reason. So what's the reason? Says Rashi, although God counted them in their lifetime by their names in Genesis chapter 46, in other words, when they actually came to Egypt, they were counted. Now, by the way, we're going to see in a minute that we're going to get to very quickly. Verse 6 is going to say that entire generation passed away. So Rashi says, so he counted them in their lifetime when they came down, and now he's counting them when they passed away. He counted them again after their death to let us know how precious they are to him, because they were likened to the stars, which he takes out from beyond the horizon and brings them in by number and by name, as it is said, who takes out their host by number. All of them he calls by name. This is from Isaiah, coming up in one of the Haftarahs in the next couple of weeks. So what Isaiah says is God has so many stars, but he counts each one by number and by name. Every star has a name, meaning for Hashem, every star has its own individual importance. And the same thing is with the tribes. What Rashi is saying, Lodia Chibatan, here they say precious. Chiba is more like love, but okay. Preciousness, love, okay, synonyms. But the point here is that the reason why we are recounting retelling the names of the children of Israel is because it represents the love. And like I said, Rashi says it here, Rashi says it elsewhere in the Torah, whenever there's a census, especially when it's a census close after a previous census. So you say, why do we keep doing this? Why are we engaging in this? And the answer is it's an expression of love. And this is what I mentioned to Seth. And that is that in the Torah here, you have both. You have the names of the people, but it also says in verse 6, it says, in verse 5, and now all those descended from Jacob were 70 souls, and Joseph, who was in Egypt. We'll get to that in a minute. Joseph is counted within the 70. But in any case, we're talking about names and a number. And then the question is, what is the significance of name and number? And I already said it, so I'll say it again briefly. And we say when Hashem counts a number represents, in a way, there's a certain beauty about a number. Because the Torah also, there's a lot of counting numbers, and we want a census in multiple places. And usually when there's a census is related to also to atonements, because they wouldn't count the Jews. Each person would give a half coin, and they would count the half coin, and that's how they would know how many Jews there were. And the Torah usually uses the word lechaper, to atone, when it comes to a census. So a census is atonement, a census is love. And the idea is that when you count a census, on one hand, you say name sort of erases the individuality. That's the negative way of looking at it. Positive way of looking at it is that when you're counting the name, you're counting what everybody has in common. What does everyone have in common? Not the lowest common denominator. What everyone has in common is the essence of the soul. And in other words, when you do a census, Moses is one. Moses is only counted as one. And the most simple Jew is only counted as one. So you're basically saying they're the same. How could Moses be the same value as the most simple Jew? The answer is because at the core of the soul, all Jews are the same. So when you're counting the numbers, what you're really highlighting is what all Jews have in common. And what they have in common is a core of the soul. And at the core of the soul, everyone's equal. There's nobody greater than the other person, no matter how great any individual is. But the essence of the soul, we're all alike. It's a part of God. Can't make divisions within God. So the census represents the essence of the soul, the expression of the essence of the soul, reminding people that you have the essence of the soul, and Moses is no greater than you, and you are no greater than Moses in one sense. And that highlights the essence. But then there's also the idea of a name, and a name there's the value of your individuality. And both are important to God, and both should be important to you. And you think about it, myself, I think about what I have in common with other people, which is the soul, but they also have my own individual path, my own individual perspective, my own individual experience, and that makes me different. And both are important in the way we live and operate, and it's both, and God values both of that within ourselves, both those elements. So that's a little bit about the number and about the name. Okay, the next step on the agenda is to find electricity, because otherwise the computer is going to lose power. So give me just a quick second. I'll just see if I can. I have to move the table just a little bit. Out to side. I'm going to pull this in, Seth, so you can join us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see if I can do this here. The lesson is you have to be plugged in. There must be that, right? That's a mystical lesson. Okay, beautiful. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay, next question, next issue we have to deal with. So much to talk about. One beautiful interpretation is a beautiful interpretation, but first I'm just going to say verse 5, because verse 5, we mentioned it before. Verse 5 highlights that, verse 5, now all of those descended from Egypt were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt. That is what the Torah says. The Torah says it also the first time around. If you want to look back to the portion of Vayigash, where they actually came down, the original time, where they actually came down, and we have the detailed census, where it actually mentions the names of all 70, not just the 12 sons. There too, it says, yeah, it doesn't say this exact word. It talks about verse 26 on page 261. It talks about all the persons coming with Jacob to Egypt, his own descendants, aside from his wives, the wives of Jacob's sons, 66 persons in all. And Joseph's sons who were born to him in Egypt numbered 2 persons, all the people of Jacob, of Jacob's household, who came to Egypt, 70. So there's a math. The math is done. There's 66. There's Joseph and his two sons gets you to 69. And then everybody is 70. Nobody knows who the 70th person is. So there's one interpretation is Yocheved, Moshe's mother, and she's not listed because she's born literally at the entrance. In the language of the sages, Bein HaChamot, between the walls, on the way into Egypt. So that's why on one hand we don't count her because she wasn't born, she wasn't coming. On the other hand, she is counted because she's sort of born at the entrance, which metaphorically is very profound, because Moshe's mother is almost like the Redeemer has to be, on one hand, has to be outside of the problem, but has to be able to sympathize with the problem. So Moshe's mother, one who gives birth to Moshe, has to be on one hand from the previous generation who was in Israel. She's sort of born outside of Israel. But on the other hand, she has to be relatable to the people who were born in Egypt, right? So she's sort of the bridge between those two perspectives. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that it's Jacob himself. But what I'm trying to say is that it's clear that we count the people separately and we count Joseph, and then we make the total. So there's Jacob and his family, and then there's Joseph. So here we're doing the same thing. In verse 5, it says, all those descended from Jacob were 70 souls, and Joseph, who was in Egypt, or was in Egypt. So you could look at this and you could talk about this sort of as a technicality. We have to get to 70, or there's 70. You should just know that Joseph was in Egypt and he could be counted as part of the 70. But you could talk about this and say this is actually much more deeper, and it's actually a bit greater compliment to Joseph. And just to go back for 1 second, again, the English here botches everything up. Let's see if the art school botches it up too. I imagine they will, because it doesn't work in the English grammar. Yeah, of course they botched it up. In other words, they mistranslate it because it has to be readable. The problem with the verse 5, it says, all those descended from Jacob were 70. What does it say? Were 70. Here all the persons who emerged from Jacob's loins were 70 souls. Both translations that I'm looking at write 70 souls. The problem is that it doesn't say 70 souls. What does it say? It says 70 soul in the singular. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they forgot 2 letters, not nafshot. No, it says nefesh, soul, individual, singular. So what's happening? It's so strange that when they have to translate in English, you're not going to write 70 soul. It doesn't make any sense. You can't even write it. But in Hebrew, you can write it. Why? You could say nefashot, souls in the plural, but it emphasizes that this unity between this family. This family is not fractured. Family is united, and that's a beautiful thing, because in different places we talk about the Torah changes the form from plural to singular to highlight the unity. For example, one famous place where the Torah does that is when the Jewish people come to Sinai. When the people come to Sinai, so we know in the desert the Jewish people are complaining and fighting, and they're not really united or cohesive. But when they come to Sinai, it says, Vayichan Sham Yisrael neged Har, Israel camped there opposite the mountain. But it says it in the singular, not Vayachanu and they camped, but Vayichan and he camped. It says in the singular. And Rashi quotes the sages that say, Ki ish echad belev echad, like one man, like one with one heart. So the speaking in the singular represents the unity. So here we have then all 70 souls. And there's a contrast to that, because when the Torah talks about Esav's children, it talks about them in the plural, because there was division. The bottom line is, if you accept that the Nefesh highlights unity, now it's even more interesting that we could include Joseph in the number 70. And there's 2 ways to look at it. There's all kinds of ways you could take this interpretation. You could say Joseph was in Egypt. Now we know why Joseph was in Egypt. Why was Joseph in Egypt? Torah says, "Yosef hayav Mitzrayim." Joseph was in Egypt. Why was Joseph in Egypt? Joseph was in Egypt because his brother sold him to Egypt, right? So that was a terrible act of betrayal and division. Yet they're still united. They still consider themselves one family. They're still considered nefesh. They could still be included in that oneness. So that's a profound compliment both to Joseph and to his brothers, that even, especially to Joseph, but maybe even to his brothers as well, that even after what happens, the events that caused Joseph to be sent to be in Egypt, nevertheless, you could say that it's all nefesh, it's all one soul, they are all united. So that's one angle. Another angle is just simply to talk about the idea that Joseph, we talked about this last week also, that Joseph could be united with the values of his father and his grandparents, even though he was not, for much of his life, he lived alone in a different culture in Egypt, and yet he was united with them in their belief system, and he could be considered part of that family. Also, a compliment to him. It's easier to be part of the clan and to follow the same customs and belief system if you are in an environment that supports it. But if you're alone in a foreign country and you're in the epicenter of that other culture, and yet be one family with your family who's far and distant, that is certainly a much greater feat. So here, what we're talking about when we say everybody was, all 70 souls were all one nefesh, all one soul, all united. So that the Torah emphasizes, and Joseph was in Egypt, and despite that, they're all nefesh, they're all united. So I think that's a beautiful interpretation. The simple interpretation is simply that Joseph is part of the 70. Even though he was in Egypt, he's part of the 70. But already Rashi talks about the fact that no, Joseph was in Egypt, and nevertheless he's part of the 70. He's united with the rest. So I'll read Rashi, because Rashi is going to say it better than I could. Here we go. And Joseph, who was in Egypt, now were not he and his sons included in the 70? What then does this teach us? Did we not know that he was in Egypt? In other words, we know Joseph is part of the 70. We know Joseph was in Egypt. So why does the Torah have to emphasize Joseph was in Egypt? We know he's in Egypt. We actually read the last 4 portions in the Torah, and all we learned about is how the story of Joseph in Egypt. So Rashi explains, but this clause comes to inform you of Joseph's righteousness. The Joseph who tended his father's flocks, is the same Joseph who was in Egypt and became a king, and he retained his righteousness. This comes from Sifri. So the point is, Joseph is still part of the 70, he's still part of the family, he's still part of his righteousness, despite the fact that he was in Egypt, despite the fact that he was in a culture that was the antithesis of the culture that he grew up. Yeah, so that's the other idea that, that's the idea that even though his brother sold him to Egypt, nevertheless, he considered himself part of his family, certain degree of forgiveness. Yeah, so this is the two ways of reading the nefesh, this individual soul, that the whole family is one individual soul. Beautiful. Okay, let's see if there's something nice to say. So far, I'm only saying, I'm not saying anything controversial. I'm waiting for some pushback. I'm waiting for some.
I think creates
Yeah, a little bit, not too much, a little bit. Okay. What happens in the Torah is sometimes every letter is precise. So I was looking at this last night. It was late at night, so I didn't remember. But I was looking at the commentary on the book of Exodus. I opened the first verse. I opened the first word. Where are you going to start from? Right? It's easy. You start from the beginning. So on the first letter, there's commentary on the first letter, and one commentary. The Or HaChaim has like 4 or 5 interpretations on the first letter. So if you want to get into this and see how every letter is precise, we could talk about the different interpretations of the Or HaChaim on the letter Vav. The problem with the letter Vav is the letter Vav is and. Now, I don't know, do you start a book with and? I'm not a writer. And these are, you could start Eila Shmot. These are the names of the sons of Israel. Be a perfectly nice way of starting the book. In fact, if you look at the other portions in the Torah, there are 2 other portions in the Torah so far that start with the word Eila. Let me just make sure I'm saying the right thing. Otherwise, I'm going to get myself into trouble here. Noach starts with Eile. Eile toldot Noach. These are the offsprings of Noach. It doesn't say, and these are the offsprings of Noach. You start a parsha, you say these. You don't say, and these. One more parsha starts with Eile, that's toldot. My son's bar mitzvah parsha, I should know that. Toldot, I don't remember if it's Eile or Ve'eile. Oh, here it's Ve'eile. Here it's and. But that makes sense because we just finished talking about the stories of Isaac in the previous book. So in the previous parsha, so it's Ve'ela and these. So you see both forms are okay. But you're starting a new book, and these are the sons of Israel. So and is obviously connecting this second book to the first book, right? Because in the Torah, remember, in the Torah, even though there's no break between different parshas, there's only paragraph break. Between book and the other book, between each book and the Torah, there's actually 4 blank lines. I don't know if you ever seen it, but there's 4, like between parshas, it's just, you can't distinguish between one parsha and another parsha. Just by looking at the Torah, you have to look in the Chumash to see it, because it's just, every parsha has a bunch of paragraph breaks, and then the next parsha, just another paragraph break. There's no new title. Hey, here's a new book, a new parsha. But you do have it with the books. A new book is 4 lines, it's 4 blank lines. And after the 4 blank lines, you have a new book. So you have a blank. So Ve'ela says, and, what does the and say? And is in Hebrew grammar, you call it Vav HaChibur, the Vav that connects. It connects this word with the previous, with the previous book. So somehow we want to connect this story, this second book to the first book. So the Or HaChaim, as I mentioned, has many different interpretations of, I only quoted, I think 3, maybe more. I only quoted 3, but he has more. And we just late at night, it's hard for me to see. Okay, the first thing he says is we're connecting the sons to the parents. In other words, don't make a mistake and say, oh, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were so righteous. They're the patriarchs that are so righteous. They're removed from everybody. And now it's the story of the children, and we're just a big descent. He's saying it's a connection. Parents and children are connected, and the righteousness of the children is just as great as the righteousness as the parents, right? Again, we're addressing the fact that it seems that there's a big shift between the patriarchs, which are righteous people, and then Shemot is the people, the common people, the nation. So you could say we're the nation of Israel, but we're too removed from the holiness of the patriarchs. So the Torah adds that vav, connecting and saying, no, the children should understand, the nation should understand that they are in a way the same level of righteousness. The Talmud says that every person has to say, when will my actions be as great as the actions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? In other words, say that I could be like them. It's not like they're too removed. And it's like, oh, there's a different story. These are legends. These are myths. No, this is something that you can become. And that's the vav, that's the connector. That is one interpretation of what that vav does, that connector. Another interpretation of the vav is telling you, connecting this story to the previous stories, because we talked about this in the past. When you look at Abraham, when we look at the story of Abraham, when God tells Abraham about the Exodus, we know that God says that the Jewish people will be your descendants. God tells Abraham, your descendants will be foreigners in a foreign land for 400 years. And they will be enslaved, and afterward, God will punish the oppressors and bring them back. So 400 years is the figure. The problem is, if you do the math, you understand that the Jewish people were not in Egypt for 400 years. They were in Egypt for 210 years. From the moment that the Jewish people arrive till they leave is 210 years. And only some of those years were slavery, right? Because slavery took time to develop until that entire generation died out, as we're going to see. So what we're getting at here is so there's different interpretations of where do those 400 years go? How do you get the 400 years? And the common interpretation is that the 400 years begin with the birth of Isaac, right? Because God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be foreigners for 400 years. So the clock starts ticking when Abraham has a descendant, when Abraham has Isaac. And then Isaac, in his lifetime, again, he never had the peace and prosperity that Abraham had, or he didn't have he had prosperity, but he didn't have the recognition, and he was always a foreigner in the land. He didn't have the recognition that his father had. Whatever the case is, we talked about this in the past, that the slavery, the being foreigners begins at the birth of Isaac. And even though at some periods they were still in Israel, but they were not in Israel in a way of ownership. And that's why they only get the land of Israel when they come back from the slavery. But in any case, what I'm trying to get at is what the Or HaChaim is saying. This story of the slavery is a continuation to the previous stories of the patriarchs, because we have to combine both these books to get to the figure of 400 years. So the slavery doesn't start at this point. This is just a continuation, or it doesn't say slavery 400 years. To be accurate, it says they're going to be foreigners in a foreign land for 400 years, and they will be enslaved, which means the slavery could be only part of those 400 years. But in any case, this is not the story of the being foreigner. That actually started beforehand, counting Jacob's life, counting Isaac's life, and the Elah is combining those stories. And it was all the same story, and that's how you get to the 400 years. That's the second thing he says about the Vav. So now we have at least two interpretations. Why we say the and for one more, for good luck, assuming my phone opens. Yeah.
Of the 210 years, it seems to be definitive. How many of those 210 years were enslaved?
Well, certainly not. It could be it says it somewhere. It could be it says it somewhere. Oh, it does say that it was something like 86. Something like 86. The third thing he says, which is similar to the second thing he says, is that this is actually praise for the children of Israel. In other words, we have a press, sometimes when you have a study, you have to figure out, what do they call it? When they test, you have to have a control group. So in this case, you have a control group to see how, quote unquote, normal people would behave in this circumstance. And that gives you the praise of the sons of Jacob. What am I talking about? I'm talking about that, again, based on the second interpretation, which is that both last book and this book has to be combined to get to the 400 years. So the Or HaChaim takes it the next step, and he says, just like the previous generations, just like Isaac knew about this promise to Abraham, just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew about the idea that there's going to be slavery and there's going to be being foreigners and being enslaved, the children also knew about it. They always knew. It was passed on to the children. And yet, they did not decide to abandon this family. In other words, they could have left Egypt earlier, right? When the children of Israel came to Egypt, they came to Egypt. One of the questions is, why didn't they leave? Right? They came, they got some bread. They could have left. Joseph invited them, but why didn't they leave after Joseph passed away? Before he passed away, after Jacob passed away, why didn't they leave? That's one of the questions that the Torah does not address explicitly. The Or HaChaim seems to be saying they didn't leave because they knew that's what God wanted. They had that prophecy from Abraham. And that's part of the praise. Why is it part of the praise? Because if you look at the control group, who's the control group? Esav. And what happens is Esav, who considered himself very close to his father, moved out of the land of Israel. He moved to the land of Seir. Land of Seir is Edom. That's today in southern Jordan. And he moved away. And why did he move away? He was so connected to his father. So the commentaries explain the reason why he moved away is because being Jewish is problematic. And if you're Jewish, you're going to have to be part of the Jewish faith. And the Jewish faith is not always so pleasant. And Jacob knew, and Esav knew that if he would stay in the land of Israel, maybe eventually he would get the land, but in the interim period, his children would have to be enslaved. And then the sages say that there's a saying that people tell to the bee, and you tell the bee, "Don't give me your sting, and don't give me your honey." In Yiddish, you say, "Tu minish k'tayvus, don't do me any favors." Right? So in other words, yeah, you want to be part of the Jewish people? Yes, of course, you'll get the land of Israel in 400 years, but you'll also have to pay a bitter price, right? So what do a lot of people say? I'm out of here. I don't want to have anything to do with this family, and I don't want to have anything to do with this people because their story is going to be complicated. And by the way, if we're all sitting here today, it's because many people in our ancestry decided not to leave, even though to stay part of the Jewish people was very difficult. Right? So like the children of Israel, they're saying, no, we're connecting ourselves to the past. We're connecting ourselves to the story of the patriarchs, the people coming, even though we know that it's not going to be all sweet and dandy. Like it says, like the Yiddish phrase, it's not going to be just licking honey, right? There's also going to be the sting. But we understand the value of what's happening here. This is the divine promise, and we're going to be able to carry the legacy of Abraham, and eventually we come back to Israel and rebuild. And that's something they knew about. And that's the praise. And that's what the Orach Chaim says, Ve'ela, make no mistake, these are people, don't think that they're people who were just in the dark and they had no idea what was coming to them. They understood exactly what their parents understood. Go ahead.
I think it's also somewhat important to understand that Rabbi Benatar lived in Baghdad.
Yeah, Orach Chaim, yeah. Yeah.
And that also may have given him a slightly different perspective.
Right.
In terms of not living in the land.
Yes,
himself.
yes, yeah.
I can agree with that.
I agree. He is a very interesting person because first of all, he was very Hasidic. In other words, he was pre the Baal Shem Tov. He lived the same time as the Baal Shem Tov, a little earlier, but they overlapped. And so many of the Hasidic ideas, so many Hasidic works quote the Orach Chaim, even though he was from a different part of the world and they had no overlap. But he's quoted by every Hasidic teacher, so to speak. So it's funny so it's very interesting. So you're saying the fact that he was out of the land, he had a sensitivity to this idea of connecting back to the land and back to the people who were living in the land. Yeah, makes sense.
You know the story about him with the lions?
Yeah, there's a lot of
I don't want to digress.
Yeah,
It's a very interesting story.
indeed.
My daughter's sister-in-law, the maiden name was Benatar.
Oh, really?
She's a direct descendant.
Wow. Incredible.
Not that it's such an uncommon name.
Right.
But she is.
Right.
She traced the lineage.
That's great. Okay, we could move a little forward, and then we could we have to go back in the future weeks. We'll do that. What you see here is verse 6 is interesting. Joseph dies in the whole generation, which that tells you that the slavery doesn't begin until Joseph and all his brothers die in that entire generation, right? So if you look at verse 6, now Joseph died as well as all his brothers and all that generation. And then verse 7 tells you how the Jewish people proliferate and they become abundant. So verse 7, the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very, very strong, and the land became filled with them. So all of a sudden, they start becoming a threat to Egypt because of their numbers. They come as 70 people, but all of a sudden, they are in great numbers. And now it's a threat. And the threat is that we're the loyalties. So I'm going to read verse 8 and 9, and then we'll go back because there's a lot to say here. So verse 8 says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know about Joseph. Literally, who did not know Joseph. Let's see how they translate it here. A new king arose in Egypt who did not know of Joseph. They both translate the same way. Okay, which is a very strange thing to say, right? How could you say a new king arose who didn't know Joseph? Joseph would have been a national hero in Egypt, right? So what does it mean that a person a new king could arise? We didn't hear about the previous generation, about Joseph, the guy who saved the kingdom from famine. It's a strange concept, so we have to talk about that. But in any case, he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more numerous and stronger than we are. So he says we have to outsmart them, get ready, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they increase and a war befall us, and they join our enemies and wage war against us and depart from the land. In other words, it'll be a war that these people are going to be loyal to our enemies and not to us. So that's how we have to outsmart them. And then verse 11 describes already the slavery. So they appointed over them tax collectors to afflict them with their burdens, and they built store cities for Pharaoh, namely Pithom and Ramses. But as much as they would afflict them, so did they multiply, and so did they gain strength. And they were disgusted because of the children of Israel. We can talk about that as well. Okay, a lot to talk about. The first thing I want to just point out is that who is the first person in the Torah to refer to the Jewish people as a nation? And the first person is the Pharaoh. And it probably came from a place of anti-Semitism. In other words, no, really, he said they're children of Israel, they're 70 people, so they're a big family. But when you say they're a nation, what he's trying to highlight is they have their own aspirations, they have their own national aspirations, they're not going to be loyal to us. Right? So you talk about at some point, Mark Rosenblatt said we should write a book about all the different forms of anti-Semitism and how they originated in the Torah. So that's on the agenda maybe one day, but this would be the first, this would be not the first, but one of those forms. And basically the Pharaoh saying that the people living in Egypt, the Jewish people living in Egypt are their own nation. That their own nation means maybe they're not loyal to us and maybe they have their own national ambitions. And maybe those ambitions will clash with ours. And again, this is something that was said not just by Pharaoh, but it was said many, many times since then. And maybe it's being said now also. I don't know. I mean, I don't read enough Twitter, but I wouldn't be surprised that people are saying that now as well. So that's a very old form of anti-Semitism, but that reemerged many times after that. So that's just a comment on the Am. It doesn't say Hine b'nei Yisrael, the children of Israel are numerous. No, the nation, the nation of the children of Israel, right? So they're their own nation. They have their own agenda. They have their own. They're not loyal to us. So that's for verse 9. We'll go back to verse 8. And verse 8 says there was a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And here we can go into this a little bit at length, but I'm going to just try to stay brief. Maybe we'll go back to that next week because it's a general way of reading the Torah. There's a disagreement between Rav. I'm going to read the Rashi. There's a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel, two of the Talmudic commentators. And Rav and Shmuel argue as follows. A new king arose. There's a controversy between Rav and Shmuel. One says he was really new. And the other one says his decrees were new. Since the Torah does not say the king of Egypt died and a new king arose, it implies that the old king was still alive, and only that his policies had changed, and he acted like a new king. Because you see later on in the story, when it says that Pharaoh dies, you read later in the story, it does say that Pharaoh dies, and talks about how God, people cry out to God, and God hears their cry. That's on page 301. During those many days, it happened that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel groaned because of the work that they cried out. Their outcry because of the work went up to God. God heard their mourning and their moaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. And right after that, it talks about Moses and how God sends Moses. But the point here is, so one opinion is, look, it doesn't say the previous king died. So if it doesn't say the previous king died, maybe it's not a new king. Maybe it means new policies. Because Melech means kingdom. But what is king? King is the policies of the king, right? A new king is a new policies.
Well, he saw that Israel was getting stronger, so he would create new policies
Right.
for that reason.
No, so it was certainly new policies. But I asked you a question, Seth. If you read, I'm going to give you the choice of who you want to follow. If you read verse 8, that says a new king arose, would you say it's a new king or not a new king? Is it a new king,
Well,
or is it metaphorically? It's
officially, until you
Right.
taught me,
Right.
made me think I would think
Simply, you would
it's
say it's a new king.
simply,
New is new, right?
When you talk about it,
Right. So
you always need a teacher.
no. So there's two perspectives. That's the beauty. There's two perspectives, and I'm going to say something about these two perspectives in a minute. I'll save it for this week instead of for next week. But I just want to say one thing. What does it mean? Didn't know Joseph? But how could you not know Joseph? It's impossible for the next generation not to know Joseph. So Rashi says, and who did not know Joseph means that he acted as if he did not know about him. Can't be that didn't know Joseph. He acted as if he didn't know Joseph. So there's all kinds of interpretations.
So Joseph died.
Joseph died, but Joseph Joseph was the savior of the Egyptian economy. He became the second in command, but he died. But the next generation, for a king, you say a common farmer never heard about Joseph, maybe. Even that would be hard to believe. But a king who didn't hear about Joseph, a new king who didn't hear about Joseph, that's very hard to believe. So Rashi says, there's no way he didn't hear about Joseph. Even if it's a new king or not a new king, it doesn't really matter. He didn't. There's no such thing as a king. It's impossible to take this literally that he didn't know about Joseph. So therefore he says, Rashi said, quotes the Talmud, he made it, he acted as if he did not know about it. Okay. So
I like that better. Also, excuse me for interrupting.
go ahead.
But the Egyptian people were extremely liberal. And the ancient Egyptians documented
Right,
almost everything.
right.
And, yeah, so I like that concept better.
That he acted as if.
Yeah.
That's not okay. Right, right. So I'm going to say one thing about that, and then say the broader. Maybe we'll have time for the broader. When you say he did not know Joseph, it could mean literally he didn't know Joseph. He never heard the story. That's hard to believe. So it says Rashi says he acted as if he didn't know Joseph, but it says he didn't know Joseph. So there's a commentary. I forget who says it, but he says it as follows. What it means when it says he didn't know Joseph, it means he did not get the point of Joseph's story. Not that he didn't know about that Joseph was the king of Egypt. That he knew, but he did not internalize the story of Joseph. What's the story of Joseph? The brothers try to harm him. They sell him as a slave. And what happens? He emerges more powerful. What should a Pharaoh known? If you try to do to the Jewish people what the brothers tried to do to Joseph, they're going to emerge more powerful. So even if you hate the Jewish people, you're going to try to enslave them. Yeah, Joseph is the embodiment of the fact that if you hate somebody, you can't solve the problem by enslaving them, because Joseph himself is enslaved and yet emerges much more powerful and then becomes the king. So he's trying to do the same. He's going the same pattern to Joseph's family without taking to heart the story of Joseph. So when it says Shelo Yadat Yosef means he didn't know, he doesn't think about the story of Joseph, not Joseph as an individual, that Joseph was the second in command. But he didn't put into perspective the story of Joseph, which is the brothers try to enslave him and they emerge more powerful. And that's what he missed. He thought he could.
He did get scared.
Yeah. Well.
He was scared.
Yeah. There's xenophobia, the fact of being afraid of the outsider, of the other. Right now, sometimes it's justified. Usually, it's not justified. But to do that, you have to say they're an other. And the way he paints them as an other is by saying, he tells his people they are Am Bnei Israel. They have their own nationality. They're not loyal to us. So he doesn't say this is the family of the children of Israel, the way they were known up to this point. Remember, I don't know how big they are at that point. They were certainly more than 70, but are they a nation? Are they a million? No, they're probably not a million, right? So at some point he says,